Okay, let's start then. Last session in terms of getting something new, which starts actually with going back to something that we did for a long time, or throughout the semester, throughout the year even, understanding, kind of wrapping up what we do and what the actual points of references are. We said we reduce, because otherwise we have difficulties, we reduce what is going on in society, on a specific perspective, namely the questions of economics, although that we know that this is not really entirely possible. You have some courses in law, and you know that law is relevant as well and playing a role in economic relationships. We talked about culture, we talked about intellectual climate or whatsoever. So all this plays a role, but we leave this out, and within this model or within this economic thinking, we reduce it further and say what we are interested in, what we are looking at, is GDP. GDP does not have anything to do, or it's not directly linked to questions of wealth, of well-being, or whatsoever. It's simply, and this is important to understand, it's simply a measure of economic activities. To be able to understand this means we reduce, we make another reduction, namely we reduce goods on commodities. And this means we are looking for something that is marketable, that is relevant for the market, and that can be exchanged on the market, which means at the same time it has two dimensions of value, namely the use value that is necessary, otherwise we won't find anybody who buys goods or services. If it is not needed, if it is not useful, you remember the utility function. And at the same time, the real interest in the economic perspective is exchange value, because this is what is relevant for the market. And then we talked about time as well. Time being something that has two dimensions. On the one hand, it is relevant to assess what is going on in terms of production, in this context of production, and to assess the value of something. At the end of the day, it all boils down to time. The time we invest. And this is the time we invest for production, and it is the time we invest as consumers, meaning earning the resources we need, but as well looking at opportunity cost. We all talked about these detailed concepts, looking at how much time do we invest to consume something, and then considering, is it worthwhile in inverted commas, or do we spare the effort? As well, time is relevant in another understanding or another dimension, namely to understand what is going on in the economic process. We divide this process into certain periods. Meaning, if we look at the GDP that stands here at the top, we say we are not interested in the GDP in general. Of course we are, but this is a meaningless figure. We are interested in the GDP per month or per year. So we have a chronology that allows us as well to look at the development. Development is always relating two periods of time, period A, period B, and usually we have simply the chronology, the calendarized way of doing so, it's 1 year. Or we look at the GDP development within or from month to month, just to make things easy. And then we have another dimension to understand what is going on, and this is the dimension of space. We start as individuals with our own space. What can we reach? What are the products? Which are the products that we can have, that we can buy? Which is the space that is available to sell goods? Again, it's something for the individual as consumer and for the individual as entrepreneur. But it is as well relevant, and this is what we saw, I think, last time, it is as well relevant when it comes to macroeconomics, to politics, policies in economics. Taxation is bound to the state. We may have as well taxation that is bound to municipalities. But usually, we think about the state, because the nation state is still the framework within which we deal. Now, it can be simply the nation state. It is in some cases, and this to some extent it depends as well on the products we have, it is in some cases the municipality or the community, and it is in other cases states going together, meaning building an entity that is of relevance. But let's first think about not even the state, but going back from where this unit, from where this entity comes. And we talked about this in the first semester, when you may remember the name Karl Polanyi looked at, or when we looked with Karl Polanyi at an early pre-capitalist orientation that was based not on the market in the sense we know it today, but that was a completely different setting, characterized by distribution, by reciprocity, and importantly by householding, by managing the resources that are available, that are immediately accessible, that are of immediate relevance. Of course, there was exchange taking place in terms of reciprocity, in terms of distribution. But it was not as a matter of changing money. It was not about doing so in order to get gain. And this was the sea change, where we can say there was this new development, a fundamentally new orientation. And we have had this quote earlier, and it is so important that it is worthwhile to repeat it, where we have this orientation on gain. Now, this is, of course, something that we understand as a wide social process, as a development in society, and it was not actually happening from one day to another or even from 1 year to another. It was a process. We talked about it. It was the process developing from the early stages of city-states, of Renaissance, of Enlightenment. All this played a role. But at some stage, we have this reorientation of all activities. Economically, in the strict sense, you can actually put it into the formula of C exchanged against M exchanged against C apostrophe, where the apostrophe stands for more. In the pre-capitalist, pre-gain-oriented society, this apostrophe, this more, meant we are looking at commodities. C stands for commodities, M for money. We are looking for commodities of greater utility. We want something that we don't have, somebody else has it, and it is useful for us. As simple as that. Utility. Utility function, and you know all this. But to understand it, it is important to say this was the orientation. It was on use value, it was on utility, it was on what do we get in terms of the products, in terms of commodities for our use. This changed dramatically, fundamentally, where we do not have commodities at the beginning, but where we have money in the beginning. And we are not looking for goods, for commodities of greater utility, but now we are looking for gain, meaning we invest money into commodities, we buy commodities, we buy factors of production to sell what we produced in order to get more money. In order to gain. The use value as such is not important anymore for us. It is, of course, important for the consumer, but we are not interested in the well-being of the consumer. And we know, we talked earlier about it, the money is always in the hands of the buyer. This is the important underlying thing. So far, both CM to C apostrophe and M to C M apostrophe had been originated in a kind of small area. Especially in the pre-gain-oriented economies, we knew the people. This was why distribution happened. There was something we knew, this person needs this and that, we give it, and at some stage we will get something back. It was not this change, how much we negotiate before, how much do I get back. It was this as well negatively steered process or controlled process. There was this one person, this one power who controlled, centrality. Anyway, now we have still, first and foremost, not necessarily the people we know, but the people that are in reach. Closed economies. And this is what we are talking about today. The two concepts, closed and open economies. Closed economies, usually we take the nation state here as point of reference. It's one space where we do not find export, where we do not find import, where capital is used within this entity, and basically you can say these are self-sustaining entities. There's no trade with anybody outside. Is there anybody who can imagine this? Probably not, because we know today we have, of course, what is named here an open economy. meaning we import goods, we export goods, and more or less every country does it. And it is about goods, it is about services, at least tradable goods, tradable services. And there is as well capital flow. It is sometimes capital flow that we invest in another country. It is sometimes that we go actually from one country to another country and establish our business there. Now this sounds like a simple thing, that we have what we see, what we perceive normally, especially if you don't read the newspapers on economics. We have this free trade. Everything goes around the world and we have all these open processes. But in actual fact, we don't. There are still many restrictions, and part of it, to understand it, is this limited openness. There are special trade agreements, there are special links between countries where you have independent countries. They are open to global markets, but at the same time they say, and there are fixed rules, very strict rules, okay, you can trade with whomever you want, but with these countries, BRICS, ALBA, European Union, there are special favorable conditions. It is easier, it is cheaper in terms of regulation, in terms of tariffs, in terms of taxation. So what do? You go where it's cheaper, where you have favorable conditions. One interesting point, interesting because it developed historically over during the short period, historically at least, is the European Union, where you have had different nation states doing their own business, entering the European Union, being favored in the trade within this association. And then you have a step further. You take more independence away. You integrate it more by having only one currency. Not for the entire EU, but for many of these countries, they don't have their national currency anymore, which means at the same time, they lose the power of monetary and to some extent as well of fiscal policy, because this is given away. I have had my central bank and could independently use the central bank, use monetary policy to make my economy work in the best way for me. Now I give at least some of this power away. I still have central banks, national central banks there, but I have as well a European central bank that takes over, at least to a large extent, this power from the national level. And there you see exactly the point or the problem with it, if you go into this, deeper into the analysis, that you have huge inequalities within the European Union, within the currency, space of currency, but at the same time, you don't know how to deal with it because all these different regions now, all the different countries lose the power to control. We can't go in detail into it, and we will go to some issues later. First, what actually happens when we have an open economy? And this is very basic, very simple stuff. We have exports, we produce in one country, in our country, and we export this stuff to another country. Import the other way around. Products, stuff is produced in another country and we import it, meaning we get it into our country. Sounds very simple, is very simple if we do not consider the details that are involved and that we will learn about later. Net export, we have to try to balance it. Net export is the value of the exported goods and the services minus the value of the goods and services that are imported. So we relate imports and exports, and this is then the net export as figured. As I said, it's very simple, and it is very simple, but it's not just getting goods from somewhere and bringing goods to somewhere, but it is as well that there are certain necessities of balancing this. First, then, we have the trade deficit, meaning imports are larger than exports. We import more than we export. And then trade surplus, just the other way around. And the challenge is really the balanced trade. To get, at the end of the day, to the same amount what we export and what we import. Of course, different products. And there we come to the first difficulty. It's easy to compare. We export product A, we import product A, and then we can compare if it's the same quality. But as soon as there is a difference, we have to go to the abstraction of we put a value onto it. And then the next point is it's not only about goods, it's not only about goods and services, but it is as well about capital. And it is increasingly important. It is a dominant factor that we have in many cases actually national economies that are to some extent dominated by foreign companies simply because the money for investment comes from outside, foreign direct investment. It's not indirectly influencing, but it is directly taking over, if you want, the production in another country. Then you come to all these points that are influencing this process. There are issues that are important as well, and that seem to be not relevant for us. Government policies. We are dealing with economics. Why are we dealing with government policies? The one reason is that the government makes policy in our country and in other countries that influence economic processes, taxation, consumption. But as well, it is, for instance, perceived political stability. Who wants to invest in a country being or facing the question there may be a war in the next year? There may be a coup d'etat next year. The coup d'etat, change of government, violent change of government, somebody taking over. It happens frequently. So who will invest in a country where you don't know what is happening in the next year? So we want to have stability, meaning predictability. And then you come to the more specific issues. Interest rates, exchange rates, we will talk about this. Relative income. It's the relative income that counts, which includes as well the relative wages That's income from the other side. It's not only income that can be spent for buying goods, but it is as well the money people get as income, and they can, which is wages that have to be paid for the production. Then you have specific taxation. I said you have in many cases, you find frequently the situation that you can potentially do trade with any other country. But there may be a specific taxation that supports trade with other countries and makes it more difficult to make trade with other countries. So you would have a favorization of some countries in relation to others. It's taxation, it's tariffs, there are different ways of dealing with it. So there is a multitude of things actually going on that influence this process. As I said, the idea behind it, the necessity in economic terms, is in some way to find a balance between them. Why? It is a very simple thing. Imports cost money. If you import goods, if you import services, you have to pay for them. From somewhere, you have to get the money. To some extent, you can get it from the internal, from the national economic process. But at the same time, as higher as the imports are, in relation to your overall production, national, domestic production, you will have difficulties at some stage where you reach a threshold that you cannot produce and sell enough in your own country to pay for what you for what you import. The same is the other way around. Export is good for some time and to some level, but if you only export, at the end of the day, in the extreme case, you are starving because you gave everything away. This is the extreme case, but even if you don't go thus extreme, you have the problem that people in the country, domestically, do not have enough resources to buy sufficiently to maintain a certain living standard. And this is about personal, individual living standard, but it is as well about investment. It is about schools, it is about health system. You need all these things, and you cannot simply produce enough in your own country if you are over certain thresholds in terms of export. There is as well, so this would be the second point, unbalanced system implies, on the other hand, undersupply shortage, or the first point. And then the third point is dependencies. On both sides. We saw this in the early 70s, and I don't know exactly who the we are. It was Europe, I know this, and it was the United States. I don't know how far it affected Asian countries. But the situation was simply that a group of countries, a relatively small group of countries, controlled the oil. So what happened? These countries, OPEC, said, we increase the price. Oil instead of, I don't know the figures, of course I don't know figures anyway, but we increase from 100 units per barrel on 200. This means the entire economy of those countries who depended on this importing oil were near to collapsing. Oil is in everything, not in everything, but it's used. The oil dependencies of countries, of industries is tremendous. So if you have one of the most important raw materials doubling in price or multiplying in price, you have a problem. And you cannot replace it simply, say, okay, we just dig a hole here and we have our own oil. Now this was what happened, that many countries looked actually for other sources of oil. We talked about this in terms of comparative advantage. If it is too expensive in one place, you try to find other resources and you may invest more because then it is, at the end of the day, cheaper. Before, when it was cheap, it was okay to import it. Now you have to look for different sources. The dependency is the other way around as well. And you can take this oil again. I don't know enough about it in terms of technology and environmental issues and the real issues, but there is this saying of peak oil, meaning we come, or we are already at this stage where we do not have oil anymore. Meaning, what do you do if your economy, your national economy, depends completely on oil? Now let's make it easy, let's make it simple, and say you have 95% of your economic force comes from oil. And tomorrow the ground says, sorry, no oil anymore. Simple as it is as simple as it is, you are bankrupt. You can't do anything. You have your 5%, and this is not enough to make good for the others. So, of course, there is not this one day where you have this complete stop, but it shows at least what can happen if you have an extreme dependency on one economic source. There are other problems with it, namely that we are dealing with this balancing challenge. However, if you go on the international market, what you see empirically and what you can prove by all these little calculations we already had, the equations, you have, of course, the large companies that are able and willing to produce in another country, to export capital. Foreign direct investment does not happen from the small workshop around the corner, saying, okay, I do good here, I will go now to the United States or to Latin America or to Europe and have my small workshop there. If you have a large car company, that may work out. If you have a large industry, this works out. You have enough resources to do so, and it is attractive because then you can expect a high return. You have again here this problem of mono-industrial development. And you have something, we will talk about it again later, this process, this danger of a race to the bottom. What is meant by this? It's very simple. And we talked about wages. We can add quality aspects, environmental security of goods, emission standards, security standards of goods. If you want to produce cheaper than somebody else, you deal with these factors to reduce them. Labor costs are low, then you can be better, you can be cheaper than your competitor. If you reduce the emission standards of cars, for instance, it's cheaper to produce them. So you lower the standards. What does your competitor do? Your competitor will not say, but I maintain my high standards, I make less profits, I'm not really interested in return. You may have such enterprises, and they will be off the market because they go bankrupt. They have not enough return. Or they will say, okay, if they reduce wages, I will reduce wages as well. If they reduce the standards, I will reduce the standards as well. So it is, if you want to use this concept of comparative advantage, exactly this process where you say, if there is a comparative advantage, I try to compensate for it, not by producing something else, but by going the same way and using the same conditions to produce it. Taxation is another thing where you have, of course, the tension that you can influence these processes by taxation. The challenge, nevertheless, is your taxation is income, it is money you can spend. If you reduce it to attract foreign capital, to have more economic power, you are in a dilemma. On the one hand, you get more enterprises into the country. At the same time, you have less income to provide for infrastructure. It's more complicated overall because there are different streams, and it is something where you have to look as well at what happens with the taxes, where do they actually go, and what do we get out of it. But let's first go on. This is a scheme just showing where we have to go, how to balance it. We have, and this is the simplified model, we have two countries, we have two goods, and we have to go, at the end of the day, we have to come to this balance where we have an equal exchange. The entire thing of opening markets is, we talked about return, you want to increase the return, and if you are reaching limits that you cannot do it anymore, you try to find other sources outside. We talked about it in the context of communities, community economics. You need, if you do not get return enough in your own area, you need this effort, at least, the attempt of getting it from somewhere else. And it is a process that is characterizing the economic processes for a long time. Just show you only this one quote. But it shows, if you go later through it, it shows that we have this process of export orientation, of a more or less aggressive orientation to open the markets, since you have this establishment of what I said is a modern capitalist system. Now there is seemingly an alternative, and this is this ideal I mentioned in the beginning. There is no nation state. We can, apparently we have this, we can do trade with any other countries. Capital flow is free, and we can work in any other countries. We are not bound to the space where we are. I will come back to this in the second half, but this is a hugely common strategy to say we have completely liberalized system where everybody can do whatever they want, where there are no borders, there are no rules for taxation, there are no rules for tariffs. Transaction costs are actually falling away because it is the state that actually deals with this. You don't have to deal with any bureaucracy, so part of it falls away. And we have this applying the rules of origin, meaning you produce according to your standard. And you can export it, which means what I said, this process of the race to the bottom. Everybody will then say, it's not our standard is too high, it's not competitive, but we can reduce it to the standards that are cheaper. So competition, a harsh competition by this liberalization, and this will employ us in the next session. There is another orientation, and this is actually something that came up more or less recently in economics, that is this indigenous growth. We are not striving for export orientation, we are not striving to get a higher return from opening the market, but we say the origin of wealth is actually in this domestic area, indigenous. So you look at the growth actually that happens not by increasing the export, but you look for your own resources. Here you have the formula and the assumption, and the assumption is important. The output per worker is determined by A, namely the technology, which is increasing. You simply have this technological progress that allows you to increase wealth. This is a simplified model, or this is the simple model that stands at the beginning. But the important point is here A is larger than 0. This is your own power, this is your own potential that increases. It includes the knowledge, what is called human capital. It includes in this concept the improvement, the higher productivity of the workforce. So this is a different model, if you want. Not export-oriented, not oriented to the global market, not oriented to the liberalization, but to maintain, well, it's not really politically about this, but to maintain this idea of having the growth potential internally. So we'll stop here.